tier list. The one thing every WoW player says is completely useless and they don't matter, and oh my god, tier list, why are you looking at those? Yet somehow they're the best performing videos on pretty much any WoW tuber's playlist. We're also going to be talking about flavor of the month and meta, and breaking down some of the stigma of looking at this and trying to understand what you get. All right. First thing we're going to do is we're going to talk a flavor of the month and meta. So a flavor of the month spec is something that everyone rerolls to, right? If we look at Retribution Paladin changes in 10.0.7 going into 10.1, they got a rework, and a massive reroll occurred for Retribution Paladin. Now, they were also meta for a short period of while, but what made them flavor of the month is how easy they were to pick up and play and go along. It's admittedly, I've played some Ret Paladin. It's not the most complicated spec in the game. There is, of course, some nuance to the spec and everything like that. There is for every single spec in the game. But compared to some other specs, they are not that, they're not as complicated as setting up a nether portal for a demonology warlock, right? When you're comparing 2 and 2. What makes something meta is obviously how good something is. So right now is, augmentation. That's a whole different ballgame. We're not going to be talking about that. Shadow Priest, Fire Mage are the melee, the DPS specs. Bear for tanks, and Holy Paladin for healers. But primarily we're going to be focusing on healers, and we're going to bounce back and forth on DPS, and we're going to bounce back and forth towards the tanks, because there's obviously a lot more DPS specs. But when we're talking about meta, we have to you have to remember, just because something is meta, it does not mean it's a flavor of the month. For example, in Shadowlands, right up until Season 3, Windwalker was one of the most meta specs in the game. But if you were pugging and you were trying to find one, good luck. Okay? They were not flavor of the month. People did not reroll to them, although almost every MDI team, every high key pusher, you always saw Windwalker. It was prevalent in everything. But try pugging one, and that's due to the complication of the spec. Then we go to Season 3 and 4. Shadowlands, Survival Hunter, and Warlock. Primarily Warlock for Season 4, because those two specs had gotten easier with their tier sets, right? Survival Hunter was not a complicated spec to be able to just blast damage in Season 3, and Warlock at the start was spam Rain of Fire. Just spam Rain of Fire and win. That's what it was. And then they nerfed kind of Destruction Warlock down a little bit to be a little bit more complicated. And you actually, when that did occur, you actually did see a drop-off in pugs from the amount of Warlocks that were queuing up. When these things were flavor of the month and meta, they were everywhere. Every group, you would open up your pug finder, start a group for a dungeon, and you would be hard-pressed to not see multiple Warlocks and Survival Hunters queuing up for your group. It was actually difficult to avoid them, right? And like we've talked about Windwalker, if you were trying to pug them, even though they were meta, they were very, very difficult to find, because they were a complicated spec to play. The more complicated a spec is to play, including Unholy and Feral Druid in Season 1 of Dragonflight, the less likely you are to find them. There was not a massive reroll to people playing Unholy Death Knight or Feral Druids in Season 1, even though every single MDI team centered around having a Feral Druid and an Unholy DK. Literally every single one of them. They were meta, but they were not flavor of the month. So that's the first thing we kind of need to break down and kind of go, break that stigma down. But another thing is ease of play and working around cooldowns. As a tank, we know we have to pull around cooldowns in any higher level key. Doesn't really matter, right? I'm not going to be quadrupling a pack if the healer doesn't have anything to heal it, and all 3 DPS have just used their cooldowns and they have absolutely nothing. This is going to be a singular pull, or maybe a double, depending on how good your group is. And we're going to be talking about this primarily with pugging, by the way. This is mostly pugging less organized groups, and we're going to separate the two. Because one thing in particular, we're gonna pick on Warlocks here a little bit more, is as you look here, Aftlock and Demo Lock are both C tier specs, okay? And Destro Lock is the highest. Why is that? Okay? Because as I pug in World of Warcraft, I notice a lot more Destro Locks than I notice Demo Locks. But when I do pug them and I get in, Athlocks and Demolocks have a much higher percentage of doing way better damage. In fact, the bar is beating tank damage. Most Destrolocks I've seen in the last 3 weeks have trouble doing that in pug environments. Because Destrolock, for it to truly thrive, tanks have to be pulling around their one cooldowns. Well, guess what? In a pug group, in a plus 20, 21, 22, 23, whatever I'm in, there's 3 other DPS. We're not in comms, and every DPS wants their time to shine with their cooldowns, and singling out one DPS spec to allow them to perform better isn't always going to happen, right? If you are in an organized group and you guys can work the cooldowns around and really center them in so everyone's kind of getting what they need to do ethical damage and the most amount of damage, Destrolock will thrive. But Athlock and Demolock have strictly done better for me as pugs. So, but they're C tier. But, you know, you get an Athlock sometimes, and I've seen people do this. I'll join in, and I'm Ath, and they're like, oh, okay, bye, you're out, or you get kicked from groups. And you're like, but why? Like, that makes no sense. You don't, like, you're not even tracking my cooldowns. Like, do you know what my cooldown is for one of them that you're going to be able to see me do more damage? Another one is Warrior, Arms Warrior, and Fury. Now, in fact, like, Fury has a higher DPS capability, but for some odd reason, I'm seeing more Arms Warriors perform better than I'm seeing Fury Warriors, even though Fury Warriors is higher. It's one of those things where doing the base amount of damage is just easier to do on Arms Warrior than Fury, apparently. And that's one of them I know a little bit less. I played quite a bit of Arms Warrior this season, but I haven't played Fury, so I don't really have the exactitudes from there. But when you start looking at these specs, it is kind of funny. And then you look at Devastation being B tier, right? Devastation actually cranks. When you give them the time to shine, they have a 2-minute cooldown that is really strong and really bursty, and they'll have it up for pretty much any double or triple that you are planning in a pug group. And I have seen Devastation just do absolutely great single target and great AoE, and just always have good numbers. And on top of that, they bring they bring some of the same utility that Augmentation Invoker does with Cauterizing Flame. They bring a Poison Dispel, the knockups, the knockbacks, you know, Landslide. They bring a lot of that utility. Augvokers, like I said, it's this whole different ballgame. But Devastation is an insanely good spec to bring to your group if you need a Bloodlust, if you need whatever, if you need a bleed removal. Devastation's not bad. Are they into you for not playing Aug? Well, that's a different conversation as a whole, right? And then there's things like Assassination Rogue. Assassination Rogue is all the way down here in C tier because the way their spec is currently, they don't perform well in very high keys, right? The kind of how Indiscriminate Carnage and all that stuff works. But they're actually really, really good in pug groups, because most pug groups are going to pull anywhere from 6 to 10 targets per pull. Usually that's around the basis, right? Which is prime numbers for Indiscriminate Carnage, getting full Rupture, that's the word, Rupture and Garrote value, that I have been in a key with a sub-rogue who has made fun of me for playing Assassination, and I destroyed him on the meters being 6 item levels below him with much crappier trinkets. But why is that? Because the way that you pull and the way that you pug is different from organized groups. So when you're taking a look at these specs, you have to take a look at your own personal account into how you see these specs being played and how they perform around you. Right now, what's really, really strong in Mythic Plus pugging, you know, that 17 to 23 bracket, is 2-minute cooldowns. I notice a lot of these specs perform very, very well with 2-minute to no cooldowns. If you look at Beastmaster, they don't really have a cooldown. Bestial Wrath is kind of like, you know, it's just always available from what I hear. And is, you know, they perform just very well from pack to pack without having to be super bursty. But they do very, very well versus, I actually literally have no idea how Marksmanship works right now. I haven't played them since 10.0, and I know they got some changes and some reworks. And Survival is still Survival. Survival I've seen just perform all around really good whenever we get one, and it's always a nice surprise. Like, oh, yay, shorter kick, woo! But when you're making a balanced composition for your pug group, give some of these specs a chance. look at what they can do and they can offer, and don't look at the tier list and say, oh, you're up, you're garbage. You will be incredibly surprised how well these things can perform in a pug environment versus an organized group with comms and things like that, right? You know, if I was in an organized group and a plus 22 on my Warlock with PI and all this stuff, Destro would probably do really, really well for me, and that is something I'd be willing to swap. But every time I've played Destro in a key, I struggle to do anywhere near as much damage as my Aflock. Like, anywhere near as much. Aflock just always performs all around better, pull for pull, boss to boss for me, than Destro does in a pug group. And that is me playing it, but I've also seen these numbers from having people pugged it. And the stigma of tier lists is incredibly real. This is kind of my plea to the WoW community. When you see these, you have to stop and think, am I pulling around what these are good at? Am I in the same dungeons in these? Oh, well, they perform great in a plus 27. Are you in a plus 27? Are you in a weekly 20? Are you in a 17? Are you in an 11? If you're in a 14 and you're demanding an augmentation evoker, you kind of need to start looking at your spec a little bit more and finding the mastery in that to be able to perform that well, to be able to live that, because anyone and any spec should be able to perform well in any key that isn't cutting bleeding edge. And even some of these perform a lot better than what's indicative, because the tier lists are also popularity. More people are playing Destro, so you have more numbers in these higher end keys than say Af or Demo. More people are playing Fury in the higher keys than Arms, so you just, and especially once you get to the higher keys, the more logs that you have to see from the better players, it starts skewing some numbers a little bit. So keep that in mind the next time you're making your pug group. Thank you very much for watching, everyone. Happy tanking.